So I'm going to take Erin from Florida, who wants to talk about Occam's razor. Erin, how are you?
Hey, doing well. How you guys doing?
Very good, thank you.
I'm doing all right.
So refresh it. You called last week, so refreshers of your call last week, and specifically how you'd like to follow it up this week.
Okay, yeah. So you guys might have had slightly different opinions than the other people, so I'll try to be kind of general with the way it was described last week. But basically, we talked about falsifiability and how when dealing with questions that are incredibly difficult to answer or may never be answered, like is reason reasonable, like problems of solipsism, it's best to take pragmatism in favor of, like, instead of just sitting there trying to stumble about. And I view God as a similar thing, where I think to view it pragmatically, to accept it is more beneficial. And to simplify the entire conversation, we had to end it, but their reply was, it's a violation of Occam's razor. And I don't think Occam's razor is a great argument, like to use in like trying to like uncover truth. I don't know what your opinion on Occam's razor is, but I'll like throw it back to you guys.
I have some thoughts right off the bat with this one. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not necessarily going to argue the philosophy. But I mean, I would agree that it's not always a good answer to use Occam's razor, because you do need to be aware of the unlikely things. You can't rule out something that is less likely, and you can't necessarily rely on the answer being simple, because especially in medicine, we can't do that, because if I assume that somebody has a leg cramp versus compartment syndrome, that could severely endanger somebody. So that's a case I would agree that it depends on how you're going to use the information, and does that the likelihood of each scenario change what you're going to do about it. And this is where I think we need to be more strict about criteria with when we accept truth, because even if there's a possibility for a deity, the question is, if we accept this deity, what decisions are we going to make based on that? And if we're going to have a deity that does not like trans people, I'm going to throw that out there because that's a big issue for me, or a deity that says, I want you to sacrifice your baby, or something along those lines, I'm not going to accept a deity like that on the grounds that we should just accept it. Like, I need that evidence to be present, and I need that claims to be more falsifiable in cases where we are making decisions based on it. Like, if you were going to say that I believe in a deity that just sits out in space and does nothing, and we don't make any decisions based on this deity, and we don't change anything in our lives, then I don't really care as much about whether or not that's falsifiable and whether or not you believe in it. Like, I care in terms of your critical thinking skills, but at the end of the day, it's probably not going to cause some harm. But if you bring in a deity that calls you to make decisions and impact other people's lives, I think we do need to hold them to that higher standard. I don't know what Richard thinks about this.
Yeah, I'll answer in a minute. I'd just like to hear Erin's response to what you've said first, and then I'll jump in.
Yeah, so just like to kind of narrow the scope of the conversation, I would be specifically talking about deism and the idea of an afterlife. I think the idea of an afterlife is good, like just including an afterlife, no heaven or hell label, just like a continuation of life. I think with certain individuals that are wrestling with falsifiability, it's useful for them to make the choice to think of an afterlife. There's evidence in near-death experiences that, at the very least, consciousness doesn't stop the second you die. It can continue, but what happens 10 hours after like medical death is obviously.
Yeah, here's my question though. I mean, we could go into a whole conversation about anoxic brain injury, but could you potentially see some problems with someone believing in an afterlife that doesn't exist?
I like that kind of question is like, I could see problems with people thinking in anything, whether in actuality or not. It's more like a net benefit. Like individuals obviously are going to be able to construe anything from anything. I would view it as like a net benefit, where if it's out of pragmatism, it's a willful choice. Where you're like, okay, like life has inherent meaning because there's a check mark after you die, something like to like simplify it along those lines. That could explain.
But aren't there? But I'm seeing issues with just accepting an afterlife without evidence, because this is how we get things like the Heaven's Gate cult, where people will take extreme actions to get to that afterlife, or people that just won't care about their bodies because there's an afterlife. They don't need to worry about it, or people that won't grieve their dead family members because they think, oh, well, I'll see them later. And then they have to grieve a second time because like it finally hits them that they're likely not going to see that person ever again. I think having that belief without evidence that is substantial it can do significant harm. So I'm not willing to concede the point that this is a benign view to take.
No, and for me, Erin, it sounds. Go on, Erin. Finish your point, and then I'll jump in.
Yeah, sorry. I would say that, like, yes, you can bring up, like, if you commit suicide and go on Haley's Comet, like all these crazy things. I don't like that like mode of argumentation, because I could bring up the Columbine shooters and how they misappropriated natural selection. I don't think this isn't in a valid way.
This isn't a misappropriation. How do you determine which human is going to be negatively impacted by this versus one that's going to be positively impacted? It seems like you're drawing a broad conclusion that in general this is beneficial. How do you? So you think it's a choice for someone to just blindly accept an afterlife?
Yeah, absolutely.
Does that person know exactly how they are going to respond, whether it be beneficial or not? How self-aware do you think the average person is in their own psychological states, or what's going to happen in a situation that they've never experienced before?
I just like this conversation. If you try to personalize it to the average person or the above average person or the below average person, it's not debatable. It's infinite possibilities. I'd like to keep it in a total theoretical realm. Like I get that you want to like.
Why do you want this to be theoretical? Hold on. Why do you want to exist in purely a theoretical? Because like I honestly don't really see value in this. Sounds like mental masturbation to me. Like this doesn't sound like anything useful.
What are your beliefs on this, Erin? What are your personal beliefs in this realm?
My personal belief is that all you need to make is a general hypothesis based on any amount of evidence. That evidence could be near-death experience. You could have contradictory evidence. All you need is some sort of position to take based on, like you said, it could be some hypoxic, like just random paroxysm of a dying brain that causes you to have these near-death experiences. But that's not necessarily the point. All you need is a little bit of evidence to twist into an hypothesis. If you do that, you can extinguish some nihilism in people, which death anxiety is a huge thing that plagues a lot of people. The people who don't fear death and don't have death anxiety, this wouldn't be a useful topic for them. This is more so to apply to certain people. Now, if you want to like degenerate it into Haley's Comet and stuff like that, that's unavoidable. But I don't think that's like entirely relevant to the main thrust of this.
Well, what this sounds like is you're avoiding it sounds like you're avoiding reality. Like you're using some vague theoretical argument to avoid having to make real life decisions and having to face reality. Like I understand that death anxiety is incredibly real, and I've struggled with this as well. I don't know if you know of my backstory. I kind of started my deconstruction at a forensic autopsy of a 19-year-old. Like, so I've been in situations where I've had to confront mortality, and it's awful. And you think of yourself as someday going to be the one on that table in the autopsy suite, and it's scary. But I don't think avoiding it and coming up with these rationalizations to try to make yourself feel better is an answer. I think we need to work with psychology and understand, how do we approach things like grief? How do we approach unknown answers and becoming more comfortable with uncertainty? I think that's a better route to take than just deciding to believe in something that we don't know anything about.
I mean, like, progress is made in making a hypothesis and trying to substantiate it in some way. You could be right. That could be absolutely.
No, here's what you're doing, though. There's a problem with your thought process, because you've basically made the hypothesis and you've stopped. You've made the hypothesis and you've kept that as your conclusion. What you need to do is you need to formulate a study, and you need to figure out, how do I demonstrate that this hypothesis is correct or not? You have a null, and you need to decide, do we reject the null, or do we maintain our acceptance of the null hypothesis? And you haven't done that. You've stayed in the first stage of thinking about the problem, but you haven't taken any steps to move forward to validate this. And I think that's a huge problem in your thought process. I think maybe you're uncomfortable with your hypothesis being proven false. And that's something you're going to have to be comfortable with if you want to discover truth.
I mean, clearly I'm uncomfortable with it being false because I'm talking with you guys. I'm not, like, I have issues with your reasoning because you're presupposing naturalism, which is something I'm not willing to do. I'm not stuck on whether or not there's an afterlife. I'm simply open to the idea based on near-death experiences. They're not conclusive studies.
Well, I can be open to the idea without immediately believing it. And also, I mean, we can talk about the physiology on maybe a different time. You can call in and we can talk about the physiology of brains. But, like, do you have an in-depth understanding of how brains work and how science has come to their current hypothesis that near-death experiences are not evidence of an afterlife?
I am a molecular biologist, but evidence of an afterlife isn't what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, like, basic reason to believe. It's not falsifiable, so it can't be evidence. But that doesn't necessarily mean anything. It just means we can't prove it by naturalistic means, which isn't surprising.
No. Erin, stop. Erin, I need to jump in now because I've sat here quiet for far too long.
Yeah.
So we don't just that methodology of just accepting something because either you don't see an alternative or you think it's possibly a good idea is a really, really bad methodology. It's bad. And I'm not going to pull any punches with that. You know, the time that we should believe something is when it's demonstrated to be the case. And we could sit here and it's all right. You say talking about deism and you're talking about it to be a comfort factor for people who are thinking about death. But you could literally do it about anything. You could literally sit here and stew about the orange pterodactyl that's orbiting the moon. And you could sit and stew on it forever because, you know, well, it's not been proven wrong. But that's a really, really bad methodology. The time to believe something is when we have evidence for it, not just simply because it seems like a good idea. It seems like a functional idea to us, which might have benefit to someone. That's all very good for forming a hypothesis. But as Ben said, you don't just sit on that point. You then do the work to try and figure out if that hypothesis is correct. And if you can't do that work, or if you do that work and seemingly, which is what you don't want to do the work and find out it's not the case, then at least you're in a better position. But to just sit on it it just seems like it's it seems like the kind of methodology of someone who does not care about what is true. That's how it comes across to me, Ben.
Yeah, I'm just a small point in here that kind of follows Richard's point is that, like, when we're thinking about philosophy, and it's interesting that because you're a molecular biologist, but it seems like your thought process is split between how you think about philosophy versus how you think about science. And they're not completely orthogonal fields of study. They overlap in how we should think about the world. And I think what's important, and this is something that secularity has talked about, is the fact that with philosophy, or any logical syllogism, yes, it's important that it's valid, but that's not the only important factor. It also needs to be sound before we can say that this is an appropriate way to go with our philosophy. So to say that even philosophy relies solely on these theoretical thought processes is inaccurate. You need to also demonstrate soundness of your claims, and so we can't even follow you philosophically without this component being brought to the table.
Okay, I mean, I want to respond to like a couple things, so I'm gonna go back a little bit. I would say if you're making an assumption of an afterlife, then you could assume a pterodactyl's flying around the sun. I would say you can't do that if you're specifically basing off of natural phenomena you can observe, like with near-death experiences. I will respond and say, hey, those aren't definitive evidence. There's no Cartesian certainty. There's no total reliability. Some people don't have near-death experiences. Some people do. But
I don't,
and it's not like a hill I would die on.
Well, here's the thing. Here's the problem, though. I think we're not claiming 100% certainty. We're saying that it is based on the information we have right now. This is the best next step to go to, and we're not ruling out all other steps. We're just not accepting them until we get to the point where we understand enough to say, yes, this is consistent with the reality that we see. So I think instead of acknowledging this gray area of certainty, you've gone to, well, you're not 100% certain, and I'm not 100% certain, so I'm just going to put my eggs in this basket. And that's not necessarily you can't base it on 0% to 100%. There's some gradients of our certainty levels, and so I think you need to stop assuming that we have 100% certainty, and that just because we tend to have more confidence in naturalism versus supernatural phenomena, then that means that we're just defaulting to 100% certainty in this, because that's not at all our position.
And on that point, just quickly, Erin, before you respond to that, I do want to touch on what Ben's just said, because we're not presupposing naturalism. What we're doing is we're looking at what there is around us, all the things that have been suggested, all these supernatural realms, all these supernatural beings. There doesn't seem to be any, they don't seem to have any explanatory power in the real world. So it's not that we're presupposing naturalism; it's that naturalism seems to be what there is. So we're not hard and fast there. If something came along, some methodology came along to be able to demonstrate the supernatural realm, I wouldn't say no, I don't accept that, because it's not naturalism. It's not just a case of presupposing it; it's a case of looking at what has the best explanatory power for the world and the universe that appears to be around us.
Right. I can respect and agree with that. The only issue I have is when things are like that are said, I try to come up with a hypothetical of an example that could potentially open someone to the supernatural or anything like that. And then they become the ultimate skeptic, where they go, okay, well, that could just be an explanation of that. If I was a giant creature morphed into every single material known to man and disintegrated the universe and then brought it back in a second and then looked at you and said, I'm the Muslim God, I'm the Christian God. There's so many skeptics that are famous in saying, oh, it could be governmental technology. I could be on drugs, and that wouldn't be evidence. I don't know.
But that's the case. That's a problem. That's a difficulty with what you're doing, and it's not about becoming an ultimate skeptic. It's about applying skepticism. And when you have, if you come up with a scenario that has different possible answers, and it's not unrealistic, and it's not unreliable to turn around and say, well, it could be this, or it could be this, or it could be this instead. You've got a list of candidate explanations, and you don't just jump into the one that you favor most. If I've had this conversation before about miracle claims, and oh yeah, but what if this happened and what if this happened? Well, why isn't it drugs? Why couldn't it be drugs? Because that's a non-normative event, and we can look at examples of drug usage and see similar things happening in that. So that's a candidate explanation, which is it's got much more likelihood than it being a actual miracle, which is a supernatural miracle, because we know we've got examples of that thing happening. So that's not turning into an ultra skeptic applying skepticism in that way. It's just taking the candidate explanations that are offered and finding out which is more likely. I don't know why you wouldn't want to do that. That's not a thing. It's not like a dirty thing, a dirty word that's like only a skeptic would do. Anybody who's reasonable would want to take those candidate explanations and find out which is the most likely one to have occurred, if any of them have.
Right, except for I don't think it's that simple, because the way you delineate it is it would seem the ultimatum would be solipsism, except for the thing that demarcates what like stops it from going to solipsism is subjectivity. So skepticism is a useful tool, but it's taken to any alternative conclusion, etc. It just leads you right to solipsism, which isn't practical. Most people fundamentally reject it. So I think that's a limitation.
I don't think a lot of people are taking skepticism. I mean, sure, some people are taking skepticism to extremes, but I think I'm not doing that. I primarily, my thoughts relate to ideas and their utility to the world as we know it. And then if we learn more information, then we change our approach to reality. But it seems like you're wanting to snowball this all the way to as extreme as it can go. And I don't think either one of us here is going to that extreme with you. Like it seems almost like you're trying to lead us to this place where we can you can get your gotcha and everything. But we're not making those arguments.
No, I'm not trying to do that.
It goes into kind of nonsense. Like, what's the point of going to those extremes at all, other than just mentally masturbating about like it's cool to think about, like, what is reality, like what are all these different ways I can think about this universe that we exist in, and like, are there other universes and all this? Like, it's cool to think about, but why does it matter? Why do we, like, when we have time to make decisions, like you were saying at the beginning, like this reasoning of yours is related to how we view near-death experiences, and therefore how we view an afterlife, which is much more of a conversation I want to have, because that leads to decisions and how people make decisions. Like, I honestly have no desire to follow you to some abstract land where none of this conversation has any bearing on what we're doing here. It's fun to think about, but I'm not interested in going there with you.
Well, just to clarify, the reason I brought it up, I'm not trying to dialogue tree you or create like a false narrative of you, but the reason I brought up solipsism is because in order to limit skepticism so it doesn't get to solipsism, which you agree is an extreme conclusion, you have to delineate things subjectively. There's no objective criteria that stops people from going into solipsism. So in my opinion, it's willy-nilly reasoning just as much as what I'm doing. It doesn't seem very different. It just seems like you're
no, the difference is we're limiting our thought process to what is useful and what is practical, and you're going off into abstract land, just going as far as you can go, and then saying, see, you're just as subjective. Like, no, because I agree that there's some subjective decision making here of what we prioritize. I think prioritizing certain decisions is subjective. Absolutely. You're going to have subjectivity in it. I don't claim for everything to be 100% objective, but what is the use of the subjectivity? Is it helping us make decisions? Is it helping us interact with the world? And I would say that our framework is doing that better than yours is. I think you're ending up using this abstract philosophy to then justify certain utility for this abstract philosophy. And I think it's I don't know. I'm sure somebody like J Mike might be really happy to discuss this with you. I'm not a philosopher, and it's not something I really care to discuss a whole lot. Richard probably likes this conversation more than I do.
I do, but to be honest, I agree with you, Ben. I think it's a conversation that goes nowhere because it's the proposition is itself. The initial proposition is just kind of so wishy-washy, and I'm sorry to say that, Erin, but that's how I feel it is. So I think what I'm going to suggest is, and I would like to have this conversation again, but I'd like to have it in a more structured way. So kind of go away, formulate your argument in a kind of more cohesive way than just, well, I think this is useful because it makes people feel good, which is essentially what you're saying at the moment.
But also, J Mike is on AXP today, so and I know he is probably going to be more excited to go down this path to solipsism with you. So I think definitely call him later on today.
Call us because I'm on with J Mike and I would actually like to have this conversation